Hi, this is the second video I'm doing on the Velvet Underground and Lou Reed. This is about places that they played in New York City after they got really going in 1966. So the members of the band at the start were Sterling Morrison, Lou Reed, Nico, Mo Tucker, and John Cale. They played at a lot of different places in New York, a lot of places that don't exist anymore. I'll show you what's there now. Places that I'm not showing because there's so many. They played at the Knitting Factory, working our way uptown, the Bowery Ballroom, the Highline Ballroom, a place called Crowbar that was on West 28th Street. They played at Madison Square Garden, Town Hall, Carnegie Hall. They played at Avery Fisher Hall, so they played two different places at Lincoln Center. And finally, they also did TV shows like Saturday Night Live, David Letterman, and Conan O'Brien. So they were mostly active in the 1960s, and then they broke up right at the end of the 60s. And then Lou Reed got his solo career going, playing with different bands, backup bands, and John Cale did the same. Mo Tucker did also somewhat. And then they got back together for a reunion concert in the early 90s. So this was the reunion concert that they played at in Paris in 1993 as part of their European tour. And I will list some concerts that I think are worth watching on YouTube, and I also have them in a playlist as part of my channel. And I also will talk about books that I've read that I think are good sources of information on the Velvet Underground if you want to know more. And I'll also say there's just tons of stuff written out there in articles in various publications, so there's no lack of things to read. But this video is going to try to show you actual places. I was curious as to where they played at various times in their careers. So in their music, they didn't talk too much about specific places, but one of their first songs written by Lou Reed was called I'm Waiting for My Man, and part of the lyrics go, I'm waiting for my man, $26 in my hand, up to Lexington, 125, feel sick and dirty, more dead than alive. And this is a typical Lexington Avenue street corner in the 1960s, and let's show you what it looks like now.
This is it, Lexington 125, 125th and Lexington. From the song Waiting for My Man. Here it is, 56 Ludlow Street on the Lower East Side, where John Cale lived with Angus McLeese, and then Angus moved out and Lou Reed moved in. And this is where they first started playing and practicing to turn the group into the Velvet Underground into existence. And we'll just take a quick look at the street. It's got to be the nicest building on this block, which is not hard to be. Really old-fashioned tenement district on the Lower East Side. And I don't know about the 60s, but I know in the 80s this was not a good area to be in. A lot of drug use. So, much better now. John Cale's apartment, I don't know what floor he was on. It's a described as a loft-style building.
One of the early places of note regarding the formation of the Velvet Underground was John Cale played with Lamont Young at his dream house on Church Street in Tribeca, which is still there, and Lamont Young still lives there. And they give tours, not right now during the pandemic, but they've been giving tours of the dream house, which is sort of like a predecessor to the Exploding Plastic Inevitable. It's like a total light and sound experience. So it's in Tribeca, and I've also used this Google map to show a couple of other places of note, which I will show a little later on. Lou Reed's last apartment in New York City, which was on West 11th at the West Side Highway. And I don't show it, but Lou Reed also once lived at the Gramercy Park Hotel, which I talked about later on.
Okay, this is Lamont Young's dream house at 275 Church Street, where John Cale joined Lamont Young's Theater of Eternal Music. I'm not sure if he had the whole house or if it was just on one floor. So it's an interesting area. It's between, we're on Church Street between Leonard and White Street, and White Street is where the Mud Club is, around the corner and down a couple blocks. So this is the heart of Tribeca, looking north up West Broadway here. And then that's downtown Manhattan. Down that way down south. So I wonder if their music bothered the neighbors. But this block looks pretty much the way it was back in the 60s.
The Cafe Bazaar in Greenwich Village is where the Velvet Underground, with its original foursome, played in November, December 1965. This is when they still had Angus McLeese as their drummer. And it's where Andy Warhol and Nico and some of the other people from the factory came to watch them. And that began the relationship between Andy Warhol and the Velvet Underground.
Well, I was looking for the site of the Cafe Bazaar, which was at 106 West 3rd Street, where the Velvet Underground played their first residency. But it is no more. It's an NYU dorm, and but this is West 3rd Street. So this is kind of what the street looked like back in the 60s.
The Hotel Delmonico is an interesting venue that the Velvet Underground first played at under Andy Warhol. It's a gig he set up for them in January of 1966. And it was a shocking event. It was an annual dinner of the New York Society of Clinical Psychiatry. But when the band came out and played at full volume with really confrontational lyrics, I guess a lot of people's ears were pinned back, and it was shocking to the psychiatrist. And one person described it as Lou Reed's revenge for having had to undergo electroshock therapy when he was in his late teens. So this is his way to get back at all the psychiatrists, but it garnered a review / article in the New York Times, and it was quite a splash for the Velvet Underground.
Here at 502 Park Avenue at 59th Street, which is now the Trump Park Avenue Hotel, was where Andy Warhol, when he was the producer of the Velvet Underground, got the VU one of their first gigs at the New York Society for Clinical Psychiatry. What a gig, what a performance that must have been. How shocked those psychiatrists must have been. Right here, 59th and Park.
The Polski Dom Narodowy, or Polish National House, was a venue that was available for Andy Warhol to set up something he wanted to do in the suburbs, but that fell through, so it actually came to be on St. Mark's Place in the East Village in 1966. And it was an event that featured, it was called the Exploding Plastic Inevitable, and it featured the Velvet Underground playing along with dancers on stage, and one of the dancers cracking a whip, and light shows, and just a total sensory experience. And it was hugely popular, and it was done here first, and then it was taken on the road to other cities. Here are a couple of scenes inside the Dom with Nico singing and Lou Reed and Sterling Morrison and John Cale playing the guitar. You can't see Mo Tucker, but she's back there somewhere. And Gerard Malanga is one of the factory people dancing on the stage. She's about the same age as members of the Velvet Underground, and that's an unidentified female dancer. And the setup was pretty simple. It had checkered tablecloth tables set up and people just sitting at chairs. And a lot of the people, I don't think, knew what they were in for in terms of the experience. So the crowds got hipper as time went on.
So right here on St. Mark's Place is where the Velvet Underground played with the Exploding Plastic Inevitable at the Dom, which was part of the name of the Polski Dom Narodowy, or Polish National Home, and it's 19-25 St. Mark's Place on the north side of the street. And Velvet Underground played here in April of 1966. So it's a bunch of different restaurants now. There's a Szechuan, a Mango, there's outdoor dining, and the building is still here, but it's probably changed 19 different times since the 60s. But this is where the Velvet Underground first played for the Andy Warhol's EPI. Things really got rolling in 1966 when Andy Warhol's Exploding Plastic Inevitable show did a lot of shows in New York and also Philadelphia, and they also went out to Chicago and performed for a whole week, and supposedly drew rave reviews and sold out crowds. The only thing was, the band did not have Lou Reed with them. He was suffering from a bout of hepatitis, so he had to stay back in New York.
The Velvet Underground played a lot here at Max's Kansas City pretty soon after it opened, because it opened in 1965, and they played here starting in 66 for several years. And it's a place that a lot of glitterati like to hang out at, including Andy Warhol and David Bowie, and a lot of different rockers would come to hear other groups play. where Andy Warhol met Deborah Harry, who was working as a waitress at Max's. So it was a pretty happening place just north of Union Square on Park Avenue South.
Hard to believe this used to be the site of Max's Kansas City, right near where I work on Park Avenue South. There it is. It's a 5-story building stuck in between these other older office buildings just north of Union Square Park. And this is the famous Chelsea Hotel where John Cale supposedly met his future then wife, Betsy Johnson. And I believe it's where Sid Vicious also committed suicide. Anyway, it's a real rock and roll hotel here on 23rd Street between 7th and 8th Avenues on the south side of the street. It's getting a little renovation.
Another rock palace that existed around the time of the Velvet Underground, but they didn't play there, although their arch nemesis, Frank Zappa and the Mothers, played there several times, was the Fillmore East on 2nd Avenue. And it was a huge venue, but it was only open for 3 years, and it became an operating venue right at the end of when Lou Reed and John Cale were leaving the Velvet Underground.
Not that there's any strong connection between the Velvet Underground and this place. This is the former Fillmore East at 105 2nd Avenue. What is now an Apple Bank for Savings. I don't know what the building was originally, but this is where it was all happening in the late 60s for like 3 years. On a really cool stretch of 2nd Avenue, tons of bars and restaurants.
In 1973, Lou Reed played at Alice Tilly Hall at New York's prestigious Lincoln Center, and he had a backup band from Yonkers, and according to reviews, it wasn't his best performance. He was doing a lot of drugs at these times, and he was living at the Gramercy Park Hotel, being paid for by his record company, and his career was starting to go downhill. This is what the Alice Tully Hall performance space looks like now. It's very prestigious. It's been modernized recently.
Lou Reed actually played here at Alice Tilly Hall, one of the 5 or 6 theaters from the Lincoln Center complex, here at Broadway and 65th Street on the lower Upper West Side.
Later in 1973, Lou Reed played at the Academy of Music with a different band, and it went off very well, and they produced 2 live albums from this. The first album was Rock and Roll Animal, and that's where a lot of people were reintroduced to Lou Reed, including myself. And he played songs from the Velvet Underground, which for younger listeners, it was a chance for us to learn about the Velvet Underground because it was a little before our time in the 60s, and over time gain a greater appreciation for the Velvet Underground.
The Academy of Music, where Lou Reed recorded Rock and Roll Animal in 1973, used to be at this spot on 14th Street between 3rd and Irving, but now it's an NYU dorm.
CBGB's was a club that started in 1973 on the Bowery, right at the end of Bleecker Street. And it's where bands like Blondie and the Talking Heads and the Ramones got their start, and Lou Reed and other members of the Velvet Underground probably went here to watch bands play.
And right where Bleecker Street ends and runs into the Bowery, here at 315 Bowery, is the former home of CBGB's, Country, Bluegrass, and Blues legendary club. I know Lou Reed came here to listen to bands, and maybe some of the other members of the Velvet Underground did too, but I don't think they ever played here. And it's interesting, right across the street there's a mural on a wall of someone who did play here, and maybe the subject of a future video, if you can make her out, because she's getting covered up with graffiti. But Blondie played at CBGB's across the street. It's called John Varvatos. I guess it's a men's clothing store.
The Mud Club on White Street in Tribeca was a major after-hours club on a remote street corner in Tribeca, and a lot of the rockers like to go there, like they like to go to CBGB's or Max's Kansas City, and David Bowie liked to hang out here too, and Lou Reed and probably other members of the Velvet Underground came here. And I don't think they had live acts, but it was a popular late night place. Only lasted 4 to 5 years, so it was gone by 1983.
Here we are at the Mud Club, or what used to be. This sign says only over a 3-year period, 1978 to 1981. I had it as going through 1983. This just shows you the neighborhood. It's a little forgotten stretch of Lower Manhattan. If you look down White Street straight the way down, that's through the criminal courts complex over to Chinatown. And then these are some of the buildings that are right at the little cross street of Cortlandt Street, which I had never heard of. But it's actually a kind of a neat old-time street with shutters, old shutters that go across the windows, metal shutters. It's a true alleyway of New York. Some other neoclassical buildings here on White Street. Modern high-rise that was built, and then here is the Mud Club, which it was described as being labyrinthine, and it was a loft-style building, 6 stories tall. I think it had a basement also that was part of the club. So it was long and narrow, and so this is one place. I don't know if Lou Reed ever played here. It was so small, but it was like an after-hours club. After bands and fans would see performances at CBGB's, they'd come over here after midnight.
Are you for real, man?
Why? I don't know if I caught any of that exchange, but somebody thought I was somebody. I had to tell them, no, I'm not anybody. But anyway, I just want to take a little longer look at the Mud Club. When I moved to New York, it was after this place had already closed, so I missed that whole scene. One thing is when you look at pictures of places like the Mud Club and Max's Kansas City and who was there, and you see David Bowie in a lot of the pictures. Like he was always going to clubs to hear other people play and just to party and stuff. So a true rock and roller. But Lou Reed was the same. But I'm not at that part in the book yet where it talks about Lou and the Mud Club, but I will add anything I find from the book to add to the story. But this is the Mud Club at White Street in Cortland, between Lafayette and Broadway, if you want to find it. A part of rock history of New York.
Lou Reed had a publicity photo taken in front of the Café Figaro in 1982, enjoying an egg cream, a classic New York drink. This is looking west down Bleecker Street at McDougal.
And this is the former site of Café Figaro. You can see their awnings on the second floor, but now it's just a bank branch and an empty restaurant. But we're in the heart of the village at Bleecker and McDougal. So I don't know if Lou ever played at the bitter end, but it's right down the street, down Bleecker. So this is the corner where he enjoyed outdoor dining back in the 60s. Or maybe it was the 70s.
The Bottom Line was a famous club for 30 years until 2004, and Lou Reed and his band played there during the first 10 years of its existence in 1983, and it's a concert I recommend you watch.
The Bottom Line, where Lou Reed performed in concert on one of the concerts in my recommended playlist, was here at West 4th Street at Mercer in the Village. And just like the Academy of Music, it's been taken over by NYU for one of their buildings. Beautiful building though. The Upper West Side on Broadway at 74th Street, and the Beacon Theater is the one place that I actually got to see Lou Reed live in the 80s, and he must have been playing with Robert Quine at that time, and it's still a performing arts center now. I just saw a concert there last year with John Cougar Mellencamp, who knew Lou Reed, and they worked together on the Farm Aid series of concerts also back in the 80s. Now, Radio City Music Hall here at 6th Avenue and 50th on one corner of Rockefeller Center is a place that the Velvet Underground never played. It was too big for them. It's a good-sized theater, but Lou Reed played here later during his solo career.
The Ritz was a really popular music venue in the 1980s on East 11th Street in the Village. It's now called Webster Hall. Lou Reed and his band performed there in 1986, one of the concerts that I recommend you watch on YouTube. And there's other bands that have played there and had their concerts recorded also.
Okay, this is Webster Hall, and it's on 11th Street between 3rd and 4th Avenues, and it used to be the Ritz. And
oh wow, you still here?
Lou Reed played here in the late 80s when it was the Ritz. Been here several times to see various groups. Didn't get to see Lou play here. And I was here, I don't know, 5-10 years ago. I saw a group that was big back then. I haven't heard of them lately, called Airborne Toxic Event. And when I was in there, I didn't recognize the place as being the way it was. But, you know, your memories change over time, so. But it's good to know that it's still here in the East Village, just southeast of Union Square. The St. James Theater on West 44th between 7th and 8th is where Lou did a 1-week residency to perform his New York album in 1989.
Lou Reed and John Cale composed a series of songs to honor Andy Warhol, who passed away in 1987. And they did concerts in Brooklyn in 1989 at 2 different locations, St. Anne's and Brooklyn Academy of Music.
This is St. Anne's Church in Brooklyn Heights, where Lou Reed and John Cale performed songs for Drella in honor of Andy Warhol, their first performance in January of 1989. And they later performed that piece at the Brooklyn Academy of Music later in the year. So this is right on Montague Street, the main street of Brooklyn Heights, and it's right on there's a subway station right underneath to the R train. Lou Reed commented about their performance here. He said, "The church was a very powerful part of the thing. You suddenly felt this incredible surge that this house devoted to belief can generate." So the church, beautiful church, right here at the corner of Montague Street and Clinton Street. And that's the Court Street station of the R train. This is St. Anne's Warehouse Theater, and Lou Reed and John Cale have both performed here. And it's right underneath the Brooklyn Bridge, which is a really interesting location here in Dumbo. So let's take a look at the bridge. And then there's also a popular coffee breakfast place here called Butler. So there's a 364E right here at the heart of the Dumbo neighborhood between the Brooklyn and Manhattan bridges on Water Street at Old Dock Street, St. Anne's Warehouse. Lou Reed and John Cale played here at the Brooklyn Academy of Music in November, December of 1989. They played their performance piece, Songs for Drella. And since Lou was born in Brooklyn, this might have been as close to where he was born that he played. Unless he played at the King's Theater on Flatbush Avenue, I'll have to check on that. But anyway, it's a beautiful theater here in Fort Greene on Lafayette Place near Flatbush.
One thing that might be true of a lot of bands and musical artists, but is especially true with the Velvet Underground and Lou Reed, is they got better over time. So when the Velvet Underground reunited for a single tour in Europe in 1993, they were fantastic. And there's concert footage that I highly recommend. I've included it in my playlist of one of their concerts recorded in Paris, and I just thought they were fantastic. And this was recorded in 1993, 2 years before Sterling Morrison passed away at an early age of 53 in 1995, and Nico had already passed away several years before at only the age of 49. And this came 6 years after Andy Warhol passed away in 1987. And it's a shame. They were going to also record a concert in the US and go on tour in the US, but that never happened due to friction within the band. But it's a great concert to watch. I highly recommend it. One thing from having a YouTube video about a musical group or reading books about them, you can never fully appreciate the subject matter unless you actually watch and listen to the bands themselves. It's kind of like reading a cookbook without ever actually eating the food. So I highly recommend 5 concerts that are on YouTube. I've included them in my playlist on my channel, but I just like to highlight the 5. The first one is imperative to watch. It's called Velvet Underground Redux, and it was their reunion concert recorded in Paris in 1993. The next concert, which I can't recommend highly enough, is Lou Reed at the Capitol Theater in Passaic, New Jersey in 1984. The Capitol Theater is no longer there. It hosted a lot of big name bands for several years after the Fillmore East in Manhattan went out of business. But there's nothing to take a picture of now. It's just totally been leveled, and it's totally nondescript. But it was a great concert. It's a long concert, but the crowd is very enthusiastic. I highly recommend watching that one. I also highly recommend watching Lou Reed at the Ritz in 1986. He's got mostly different backup band members, although he's playing with the same bass guitarist, Fernando Saunders, who's really great. And then there's another concert in 1983, Lou Reed live at the Bottom Line with Robert Quine and Fernando Saunders. So highly recommend that. And finally, maybe it might have been the last concert that they played outdoors, Lou Reed and a large backup band. It was at Lollapalooza in Chicago in Grant Park in 2009. And his voice starts to get a little shaky, but he really pulled it out in a couple of songs, and it's very moving to watch. Highly recommend it. Lou Reed and the Velvet Underground were influential. Former Czechoslovakian President Václav Havel reportedly once told Lou Reed, "Do you know that you're the reason I'm president of Czechoslovakia?" Lou Reed first met Václav Havel in 1990, a year after the Soviets moved out of Czechoslovakia, and Václav Havel became the first president. And they would see each other over the years. This is my favorite picture. It's at a club in Prague. They have the best seats in the house, naturally. This is 2 years after Václav Havel left office in 2003. Here's another shot of them in Prague walking to a press conference earlier in the day from the previous picture. And I believe this picture was taken at the White House, possibly in 1998. Lou Reed and his band, they were requested to play at a formal state dinner at the White House by President Havel, and the Clintons agreed. I'm not so sure they were the biggest Velvet Underground fans, especially Hillary. Bill Clinton was probably more hip to their music, but see the band standing at the right. And that's Fernando Saunders standing to Lou's left, our right. And these guys like to hang out a lot. This is a different time in 1999 when Václav Havel was in New York and Lou took him out to a jazz club. Who better than Lou? He liked to go out every night. So that was his reputation, Mr. New York. This is a mural in the New York City subway system at the 86th Street station on the 2nd Avenue line in Manhattan. And it's a picture taken in 2012, the year before Lou Reed died. And he's 70 years old in this picture. And in some ways, I feel like Lou Reed aged quickly, especially in his 60s, and looked older than his age. But he still was willing to sit for this picture to be taken, and so he's memorialized in a very large mural on the wall at the 86th Street station.
I'm at the corner of West Side Highway and West 11th Street, where supposedly Lou Reed bought his first place in the city at this corner. So I don't know which building it is. But I'm filming it now when the traffic is stopped on the West Side Highway, because it's a very loud street when the traffic is flowing, and you can see the World Trade Center down the West Side Highway, and Hoboken is straight across. Just wanted to film this building here. I don't recall the name of it. I don't see the name of it on the building, but it's an old factory type warehouse building that is now converted to residential, and you can see like a vestige of the High Line, these large rectangular areas here. The High Line was further north, but it must have come down at least this far, and this is the one building in this area that still has a vestige of it. And it's a lot of artists live here and work here, and Lou Reed also had a studio here for many years, I read. I don't know how often he used it or what he used it for. He was into photography. Maybe he just wanted to help support the cause. But it's a beautiful building here, and I'll print the name of it on the screen. I have a file on it, so I see the name of it here, and it comes back to me. It's the West Beth Artist Housing, home to the arts since 1970. This is where I always thought Lou Reed should live. He lived so close to this intersection. This is Jane Street. You can see the street sign in Greenwich, and a nice old building here, and a nice federal style block with Belgian block streets. But he wrote the song Sweet Jane, and it would have been so sweet if he also lived on Jane. Maybe he tried. Right down from, that's the meatpacking district, looking north up Greenwich. These are two books that I've read to prepare for the set of videos, and I recommend them both. The first one is Dead Straight Guide to the Velvet Underground by Peter Hogan, and then probably the best biography out there
on Lou Reed is by Anthony DeCurtis, who's also interviewed him. You can watch it on YouTube. He interviewed him at the 92nd Street Y in New York. And he wrote the book after Lou's death. And in some ways, the book is not flattering of Lou, but it attempts to be honest, and it's a good read. It's a very thoroughly researched book. Finally, it's the aspiration of everyone who lives in New York City to also get out of the city and spend time out in the country. And for Lou, at one point in his life, he had a house in western New Jersey, and he had a motorcycle that he loved to ride, pretty good sized one too. And this is him posing with one of his guitars, which I'm sure he didn't take with him on the motorcycle. But at the concert at the Capitol Theater in Passaic in 1984, he tells a funny story of how he was riding along on his motorcycle heading for the Delaware Water Gap. And it's just a really funny, endearing story. So I encourage you to watch that concert to hear him talk between songs leading into the next song that he was going to sing at the concert. I just think in 1984, Lou was 42 years old. He was kind of late in coming into his own. I know he was a dynamic, charismatic performer in as early as the 60s and 70s, but he really seemed to have a whole new level of confidence that all of his previous work was bona fide and really good stuff, and it was. And the night that his band performed a lot of the Velvet Underground songs from earlier, as well as some newer material, it really gelled. It was really a great concert. David Byrne from Talking Heads once said about Lou Reed, Lou Reed's work and that of the Velvets was a big reason I moved to New York, and I don't think I'm alone there. We wanted to be in a city that nurtured and fed that kind of talent. That was Lou Reed's influence and his legacy. So from the Delaware Water Gap to New York City to Long Island and way out east to East Hampton, where he also had a house, this was Lou Reed's territory. He says in the song New Sensations, I took my GPZ out for a ride. The engine felt good between my thighs. The air felt cool. It was 40 degrees outside. I rode to Pennsylvania near the Delaware Gap. Sometimes I got lost and had to check the map. I stopped at a roadside diner for a burger and a Coke.